Hello, my name's Helen Finch. I'm a researcher in German studies at the University of Leeds. My short provocation is going to be entitled Encountering the Same Other, Encountering Difference, and I'm speaking particularly in reference to my research on the literature written by German Jewish survivors of the Shoah or the Holocaust, the mass murder of European Jews at the hands of Nazis and other associated allies in the middle of the 20th century. This research encompasses a number of questions very germane to this project, particularly looking at life writing in the aftermath of trauma. The writers that I am looking at encountered violence at the hands of the Nazis because of being othered as Jewish, and yet they were people who shared a culture with their German persecutors. They shared a language with their persecutors. Often they reflected on the fact that they knew their persecutors intimately as friends. So my questions that I'm bringing to this provocation are asking, well, how can somebody who has been othered by a majority culture, who has experienced extreme violence at the hands of that culture, still encounter members of that dominant culture within their own shared language? How can, to put it more specifically, how can a German survivor, somebody who was born in the German lands, write in German to a German-speaking audience about their history of pain and suffering? How can they make a German audience who in the 1950s and 1960s often wanted nothing more than to say that the past was over and done with, to say that enough compensation had been given to people who had suffered persecution, who wanted their literature to reflect an optimistic sense of moving forward from the past? How could these writers find an audience? What role did their literature have in staging this encounter between Germans and Jews that would acknowledge, on the one hand, the shared culture, but on the other, the radical different experience that German Jews had of the period of Nazi persecution? There are lots and lots of questions that emerge from this. The practical questions of what German publisher is going to publish this material that often accuses the German public of crimes and attitudes that it would rather forget. Such works might find a publishing house in other parts of the world, but when the people being accused of, for example, culturally persecuting Jews are the people who are publishing the literature, how does that encounter play itself out? In fact, in many of the literary texts that I'm looking at, this encounter is fictionalized and restaged over and over again. The German survivor attempts to publish their work, and yet it is rejected. Or in other fictionalized accounts, the German survivor attempts to testify to in the German language to a fellow German, only to find their witness ignored or in some way rejected, misunderstood, overheard, patronised, or dismissed as being over-emotional, untimely. The encounter takes place, but the encounter is trivialised and is not allowed to have the impact that the survivor wishes it to have. It does not carry with it the hope of genuine societal change. So, for example, I'm just going to give you one example of a survivor called Edgar Hilsenrath, who was born in Germany in the 1920s and only died very recently, 2 years ago. He wrote novels throughout the latter half of the 20th century, brilliant novels, speaking about various aspects of the experience of German Jews, both during the period of the Shoah, but also before it, the period of Jewish culture in shtetl life prior to the Second World War, that was different and that has been irrevocably lost, but also this crucial experience of the survivor who tries to return to German culture, who tries to speak in German to a member of the German majority culture about a history that the persecutor wishes to forget. So I'm going to take his last novel, Berlin Endstation, or Berlin Last Station, which was published in 2006. Which stages this encounter between the survivor and the persecutor in an intimate fashion. Hilsenrath is a satirical and a grotesque writer, and his grotesque writing breaks through the veil of piety with which this German-Jewish encounter is often cloaked. The theorist Max Czollek has spoken of this as a theatre of memory, that German majority culture, mainstream culture, loves certain performances of contrition and restitution through, for example, constructing memorials such as the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, but that actually engaging with the needs and the histories of real living Jewish people is sometimes a step too much, because they break with the idea of the memory theatre in which everyone knows their predestined role. And Hilsenrath is one of these people who has no interest in the memory theatre in which Jews encounter Germans only to absolve them of the past, only to talk about a shared future, only to talk about how much progress Germany has made since 1945. By contrast, the encounters between German and Jew in Hilsenrath's work right through the 1950s, 60s, 70s and into this century show encounters which are difficult, which are overdetermined, which are emotional. And my question then is, what is the role of literature in staging these encounters? Can it serve as a troubling factor that disturbs the overwhelming normative force of the memory theatre that demands that all encounters be harmonious? And I hope that it can disrupt, it can be problematic. So to take an example from Berlin End Station, or Final Station, it speaks about a man called Leszczynski, a German Jewish survivor who attempts to return to Berlin in the aftermath of reunification in the 1990s. He decides to trace an anti-Semitic bully called Tischler, who in fact made his life hell in the 1930s in Germany as they were in school together, but as the Nazification of school life meant that Leszczynski was increasingly othered, and encounters both with his teachers and with his fellow schoolmates became racialised and violent. So the novel stages three fantasies, different fantasies in which Leszczynski befriends Tischler in old age, lures him away from his home, and then, having staged what seems to be harmonious, reconciliatory encounter, murders him. The three take place increasingly close to home, first in Paris, then in Berlin, and then the small German town where they both grew up. Literature becomes a means of staging a fantasy encounter of revenge, of justice that is not possible in real life. It also becomes a way of discharging uncomfortable emotions. Leszczynski is made ill by his constant obsession with the persecutions of the past. Finally, once these three fantasies have played out, another narrative takes place in which Leszczynski does meet Tischler, but in fact Tischler, the old childhood bully, is proven to be repentant. He shows contrition at his childhood anti-Semitism. He's delighted that Leszczynski survived persecution. In this narrative, there is an encounter, a positive encounter between German and Jew. In Hilsenrath's anti-sentimental vision, one personal moment of restitution cannot defend his Jewish protagonist Leszczynski against the predominance of violence, anti-Semitism and repression of the past in contemporary Germany. In fact, his protagonist ends up being murdered by neo-Nazis in contemporary Berlin. So this novel also sheds doubt on the possibility of an encounter to have meaningful political impact beyond a brief moment of emotional catharsis between victim and persecutor. Germany's pathology means that the events of the violence past must constantly be repeated, because the individual encounter, never mind how sentimentally it is staged, cannot ultimately overcome the structures that underpin othering and racism in contemporary Germany. I'm just going to finish up with a final question that has taken on great acuteness in contemporary Germany, which is that this memory theatre that I've spoken of, the memory theatre in which the contrite German is forgiven by the Jew and they both turn towards a happy future together, is also troubled by the spectre of the colonial and post-colonial other. The German memory theatre does not have a place in it for people who may not be German or may not be Jewish, but are still affected by the violence of Germany's colonial past and indeed Europe's ongoing colonial and post-colonial past. How can these people be encountered and have the right to speak within a framework that is still predicated on an encounter which has ultimately a Christian underpinning of redemption and forgiveness? Thanks very much for your time. I look forward to the seminar.